Good morning, everyone, and welcome to some stops along the way. It's Monday morning, that means a new episode, but this is a special Monday morning. It's June the 2nd, which means my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which is the companion to this podcast, is available on Amazon beginning today. I hope that you'll want to get a copy of it because it really gives the backstory that I don't tell during this podcast. It introduces you to some very interesting people, outlines some both funny and sad situations that I got myself into around the world, and highlights the geopolitical, historical, and cultural paradigms of some really interesting countries. So I hope that you will delve into my journey a little bit as I've worked around the world all these years by getting your copy of Some Stops Along the Way today. And as a bonus, this week only, from today through June the 7th, if you order a copy of Some Stops Along the Way, you'll be entered into a drawing for signed copies of my 3-volume novel series called Mozart's Ghost. One person will be selected to receive all 3 books in that series, signed by me, a $60 value, but only if you order Some Stops Along the Way this week. So I hope that you will do that because I would love to put the 3-volume set of Mozart's Ghost, signed by me, in your hands as well. Before we jump into the discussion of another country today, the country of Kosovo, I want to jump back momentarily to my last podcast. I talked about my work in the Czech Republic and Slovakia during the period of the late 1990s. And in Slovakia, if you'll remember, I told you that we led a training program at a hotel that had been formerly owned by the communist railroad company called Vagonka Poprad. And I was going through some things this morning. I found one of the glasses from that hotel has a Vagonka Poprad logo on it. And I guess it's just a reminder to me of not only that trip, but how things were when I was there, how things in that country move forward in the post-communist years. Some of the tragedy, some of the triumphs, but also the great trajectory that both the Czech Republic and Slovakia are on today as they're members of the EU since May of 2004 and have really made great strides. I still have a lot of great friends there, and things like this just reminds me of those early projects that made me fall in love with this business, but also introduced me to some really interesting and profoundly intelligent and committed people. So this morning, let's jump into a new country. The country of Kosovo. A very small country, but a very complex country. As a matter of fact, there's no way we'll have time on this podcast to unpack all of the intricacies of Kosovo because it is absolutely a complicated story. It's a story of profound tragedy, but also one of triumph. And I want to walk you through it just a little bit today. However, in doing so, there's no way to really get started with this without talking about the former Yugoslavia. Because, of course, Kosovo was, at that time, an autonomous republic within a larger context of the country of Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia existed from 1918, at the end of World War I, to 1992. And the first iteration of Yugoslavia was the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which was from the period of 1918 through 1929. under the royal house of Karađorđević. The second iteration of Yugoslavia during that period was the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which lasted from 1929 to 43. And the third iteration was the Democratic Federal Yugoslavia from 1943 to 63, and then that transitioned into the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia from 1963 until the dissolution of the country in 1992, which we'll talk more about. But Yugoslavia was an amalgamation of countries that the citizens of which were primarily Slavic peoples. These were the countries of Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, Slovenia, and North Macedonia, and of course Kosovo, which we'll talk about today. One of the profoundly interesting periods of time in Yugoslav history was the period after World War II, when it was ruled by Josip Broz Tito. Tito was an army officer. He had led the fight against the Germans in World War II. He became the leader of Yugoslavia thereafter. And Tito was a very interesting character in that he was a strong man for sure, but he positioned Yugoslavia as a major component of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He built industries. He capitalized on the tourism trade. He built an economy in Yugoslavia that, relatively speaking, was strong and successful, basically powered a lot by industry, but there were certainly other elements of the economy as well. Tito was also very keen on tamping down the nationalistic tendencies, not just of the Serbs, who were the largest people group in Yugoslavia, but also of the other ethnic groups who all wanted in some way their own autonomy and their own freedom to control the lands in which they lived and to control their livelihoods. Tito was able to keep this in check during his reign, but upon his death in 1980, tensions began to grow. His death created a power vacuum where a number of different political figures representing the different ethnic groups in Yugoslavia began to work on their own agendas and attempt to establish their own authority within the region. And this led to a continually spiraling down effect until 1992, when Yugoslavia was splintered into several different countries. It simply could no longer be held together. All these years, Yugoslavia since 1918 had been held together either by a monarchy or by a strong ruler like Josip Broz Tito, who was able to overcome or alleviate the nationalistic tendencies. But once he was gone, this power vacuum created the forces, or put the forces in play, that splintered the entire country. And so in 1992, Yugoslavia splintered into different countries: Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, Slovenia, and what was then called Macedonia, what's now called North Macedonia. Kosovo was still an autonomous unit, if you will, at that time, of Serbia. And ethnic tensions began to rise there as well, with the 80% native Albanian Kosovar population and the Serbs. Also during this period came a seminal event that really drove the political and historical context of the country of Kosovo and the greater Yugoslavia for years to come. And that is the rise of the Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic. Most of you have heard of Milosevic. He too was a strong man. He was President or Prime Minister of Serbia from 1989 to 1997. President of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia from 1997 to 2000. And during this period, he played on the nationalistic tendencies of the large Serbian population, therefore exerting his influence over the region and driving a wedge between the Serbians and the other people groups within the region. Milosevic sought to restore pre-1974 Serbian sovereignty. In 1974, the Yugoslav constitution had been changed to provide these autonomous areas like Kosovo with more sovereignty, with more ability to govern their own affairs. Milosevic didn't want that. He wanted to restore it to pre-1974 Serbian control, which was certainly not valued by Kosovo or other administrative areas such as Vojvodina, and it wasn't valued by many of the countries of the former Yugoslavia because they saw this as a power play by the Serbians to exert control over the region. In Kosovo at that time, the ethnic tensions began to bubble up. Because the Kosovo population was 80% Albanian Kosovar, predominantly Muslim, where the Serbs were predominantly Orthodox, which added another layer of complexity. But because of the large majority of Albanian Kosovars in the country of Kosovo, and the relatively small number of Serbs, there became a friction between the two people groups that eventually boiled over. The Serbs in Kosovo highly contested that they were persecuted by the Albanian Kosovars, which only played into Milosevic's grand plan of nationalism that really toppled countries in this region of the former Yugoslavia like dominoes, war after war. And I worked in all of these countries, and so we'll talk more about the wars perpetuated by these nationalistic tendencies a little bit later on. But speaking of Kosovo, in 1986, Milosevic visited Kosovo and he made the what's now famous "they will never beat you again" speech. Now, whether or not those remarks were taken out of context is a matter that's hotly debated. But the fact is that was seen around the world as a seminal act and a seminal statement that really encapsulated Milosevic's view of the world. That Serbia should restore its historical lands and its historical honor by taking control and by ensuring that the Serbian people's reputation and legacy were intact. This led to more challenges in Kosovo as the Albanian Kosovars began to push back against what they saw as renewed Serbian control. And this tension continued to rise into the mid-1990s when the Kosovo Liberation Army constituted of Albanians and Kosovars, because Albania, the country of Albania, was a staunch supporter of Kosovo. In the mid-1990s, they undertook really what was tantamount to a guerrilla war. And so tensions escalated all the way through the mid-1990s until February 28, 1998, when full-scale war began in Kosovo. Now, as far as the wars in that region go, the war in Kosovo was not the longest one, but it was a very brutal and bloody war that even today has left scars on that country. And the genocide that came out of that conflict has impacted the psyche of the people on both sides, whether it's the Serbs or the Kosovars. The war lasted from February 28, 1998 to June 11, 1999. And the reason that the war ended is NATO, led by the United States, began a bombing campaign of the Serbs that finally drove them out of Kosovo. This war led to an estimated 12,000 deaths among the civilian population. And it displaced more than 590,000 Albanian Kosovars who had to flee the country. But even more than that, it brought about a systematic process of ethnic cleansing on both sides that is the tragic legacy of Kosovo. The war ended in 1999. And almost immediately, the country came under the administration of the United Nations, something called the United Nations Mission in Kosovo, UNMIK, and its military arm, NATO, called Kosovo Force, KFOR. It was during this period, 1999, when the war had just ended, that I first arrived in Kosovo. And I'll talk about that in just a few moments. But in 2008, February 17th to be exact, Kosovo declared its independence from Serbia. It became an independent country. All through from 1999 until that time, it was not an independent country. It was administered by UNMIK, but it still was technically under the purview of Serbia. Of course, Milosevic was eventually deposed in Serbia. He was arrested and sent to The Hague, tried for war crimes, along with many of his Serb commanders. And by the way, there were also Kosovo Liberation Army, Albanian Kosovar leaders who were tried for war crimes. So there were atrocities on both sides. But Milosevic was sent to The Hague, and he died there in 2011 of a heart attack while in detention. The rulers that came after him in Serbia, while still somewhat nationalistic, took the position that took a somewhat of a less polarized position on Kosovo, and that led to its independence in 2008. Now, I will tell you that Serbia still does not acknowledge Kosovo's independence, but there are 116 other UN countries that do acknowledge it. And the current president of Kosovo is Vjosa Osmani, and the prime minister is Albin Kurti. And Kosovo's made great strides. I will tell you, in going back over the last few years, after my early trips there, right after the war, I could see firsthand the great strides economically, politically, and socially that Kosovo has made. It's a small country. it has a lot of challenges. It's very difficult for a country of that size to be able to fund all of the things that are required to ensure good livelihoods among its citizens. But at the end of the day, it has friends around the world. Certainly the United States has been one, and the European Union, who have provided the requisite assistance to help Kosovo become a strong and independent country. But let's back up for a little bit, because I want to tell you about my experiences when I first went to Kosovo. I arrived there in 1999 to work with the representatives of Serbian associations, to strengthen them to be part of civil society and to be part of building what would later become the government of Kosovo that would lead to its independence. It was very important that civil society organizations, business associations, and others be strong and be part of the discussion. Have a seat at the table, if you will, during the discussions as to what was going to happen to Kosovo as it moved toward its independence. And yet they were very small, they were very under capacity, and so a group of us went in to assist them in being able to articulate their views and develop policy positions to make them an important part of the discussion as to what was going to happen to their country. So I arrived in 1999. I immediately checked into a hotel called the Grand, which is in the middle of Pristina, Kosovo, the capital city, on a street called Mother Teresa Boulevard. The Grand Hotel was an atrocious place. It was a soul-sucking place. I will never forget walking into it the first time. Just the way it smelled, the way it looked. There was barely any electricity, so the lights would flicker on and off. And this was literally like a bad horror movie. It had been truly a grand hotel at one point in time, but by then it had been occupied by both the Kosovo Liberation Army and the Serbian, the Yugoslav Federation forces, predominantly Serbian, had been used as a torture chamber. All types of atrocities had happened in that hotel. You talk about bad juju, just bad all along the way. As a matter of fact, my staying in that hotel for an extended period of time led me to a corollary that I developed and I've shared with people around the world, is that I tried no longer ever to stay in a hotel called the Grand or the Palace, because every time I've stayed in hotels that were called the Grand and the Palace, they've been neither one. And that started with this atrocious Grand Hotel. When I went back to Kosovo years later, the hotel was closed by then. It had a failed privatization attempt, a lot of court cases. Now I believe it's back with state ownership, and the Kosovar government is trying to determine what to do with it. So it stands like an empty shell today. And I remember when I went back looking up and counting the floors, because I had a corner room, and I saw that room where I stayed, and just a cold chill ran down my back, because it was such a sad place at that period. The war had just ended. There was massive destruction across the country. The people were traumatized. There were any number of problems and atrocities still happening around the country. The K4 soldiers patrolled the streets with different countries taking responsibility for different areas of the country, it was an armed encampment. And after being out in that all day, there were many times when I went and hearing the stories that people were telling me about what happened during the war and just the magnitude of what we were trying to do. There were many times when I'd go back to that hotel in the evening and sit in the dark because the electricity was off and just contemplate the huge challenge that not only I had in doing the role that I was there to do, but the almost insurmountable challenge that the people of Kosovo had in putting their lives back together. And so that hotel doesn't have good memories for me, and yet every time I go back to Kosovo, I walk down to it as a reminder that the hopelessness I felt during that period was misplaced. Because now Kosovo has its feet under it again. It has its sea legs, even though it's a landlocked country. It's able, even though it needs help, continuous help from the EU, the United States, and other countries, it has put together a government and a society that has helped heal some of the wounds of the past and propel itself forward as an independent nation since 2008. But during that time, those early days in Kosovo, I met some fascinating people. One of them, and I share this in my book, was a young lady named Shefia, who was my interpreter. She was an Albanian Kosovar. She was in her mid-20s at the time. And we traveled several different places in the country together. But one particular day, afternoon, we were in Mitrovica, which is a city in Kosovo that at that time was under the administration of KFOR German soldiers who would patrol the city. My colleague Malcolm Toland and I went up to Mitrovica, and we met with leaders in the city. We did our work there, and at the end of one day, we were sitting on a wall near some German military vehicles, watching them patrol the city. It was near the main square. And specifically, Sheffi and I were sitting there together. And she began to relay to me the magnitude of the hopelessness that she felt. Here was a young lady that should have her whole life ahead of her. But it was like she was stuck in a time warp because of this debilitating war and the atrocities that had happened and even were still happening at that time. Well, I am a natural-born optimist, and so I was arguing that we were going to accomplish something, that Kosovo was moving in the right direction. But I could tell that Shefia wasn't buying it. And she listened for a while, and she shook her head, and then she took off her glasses and put them on her knee and said, "You know, I want to believe, Mr. Mark, what you're saying. I do. I want to believe it. But you need to understand what happened here. What you see is bad. What happened is horrific. It's what you don't see that makes it even more horrible." And she gave me an example from her own life. She said that I was in university in Pristina, and I was doing well. I had my life ahead of me, and my studies were going well, and I met a young man, and I thought maybe I wanted to spend my life with. And then things began to get worse and worse from the standpoint of the ethnic Albanians and the Serbs, and the whole political climate began to turn, and things became increasingly dangerous. And so I left the university to go home for a little while to be with my parents. And I had implored them to go back to Pristina with me because I didn't feel were safe out in the rural areas of Kosovo. There were squads of soldiers intermittently just traveling around the country creating panic and mayhem. There were Serb forces that were taking increasing control, and I just felt like they would be better in Pristina. But my father didn't want to go, especially. That was his home, and he wanted to stay in his home. But I kept it up, and I kept it up until I finally talked them into going to Pristina with me. And I made some arrangements for a place for them to live. And so one afternoon we set out for the drive to Pristina. And it was slow going because of things, roadblocks and things on the road, and it began to get dark. And we had some car problems, and we pulled over so my father could check the car. And as he was checking the car, my mother and I were sitting there, and we heard a group of people coming down the road. And I looked up and I realized that it was Serb paramilitary soldiers. And my heart just sank. I was so fearful. And they come to us and they take our documents. And the leader of this group says, "Look, regardless of what you heard, we don't want to hurt you. We just want what you have. So just give us what you have. We'll go about our way, and we'll leave you alone in peace." Well, my father didn't want that. This was everything he had in the world in this car. And so he began to argue, and I was trying to stop him, saying, no, just give them whatever they want. And finally, they determined to take it, and they did. They pushed my father out of the way. They pulled my mother out of the car, pushed her to the ground, took whatever they wanted, and started to leave. And they took a few steps. And then the leader, who had spoken so nicely earlier, turns around and he shoots my father in the head. I was screaming. My mother was screaming. The Serb soldiers just laughed. Why they didn't also rape us, I'll never know. But they simply shot him and they went their way. And my boyfriend when the car had broken down, he had gone for help, walking down the road, and I never saw him again. And she looked at me and said, "So now, hopefully you understand the backstory to all of this. These hills all around us are screaming in blood. They're screaming with the angst of the people who got erased from the earth. And no one will ever know them or hear about them. They'll just be a body in a mass grave that's found some time in the future." And so what I wanted for my life, what I thought about for my life, that's all been altered by the fact that I can't ever be the same again. They stole from me the life that I wanted. They stole from me the peace that I wanted. And I was very emotional. But I remember looking at her and said, it's not... I guess it really is, Sheffia. I agree with you. I guess it really is hopeless. We might as well just stop where we are. Kosovo will never be an independent country. It'll never be what you want it to be. And her back straightened and she said, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. Kosovo can be a great country and will be a great country. And then she stopped in the middle of her sentence. Said, you tricked me. You turned the tables on me. Now you have me being positive. I said, that's right. That's right. Because what I know, Sheffia, is this. I know that the sun will come up tomorrow. And that every day that the sun comes up is another day that you and others in this country can try to build the society that you want. You can't erase the past. What happened, happened. And I'm so sorry that it happened. If I could change any of it, I would do that. But I can't change it. And you can't change it. But what we can do is to move forward in the best way that we possibly can. Sheffy became a very good friend and an excellent interpreter. And she's gone on to live a nice life. Maybe not the one that she thought she would live, but a nice life. I met so many other people there. I could tell story after story on both sides of things that happened. Things that, for those of us who have never had to face situations like that, are literally mind-boggling. They're almost unbelievable. The head of one of the non-governmental organizations there, a think tank that I worked with, Professor Mustafa. His family was forcibly removed from their home in Pristina, from their apartment, put on a train that he knew was headed to Serbia. And he knew what was going to happen when they got there. This was a train to death. This was literally a death train. They had all their possessions with them. Serbian soldiers were on the train, ensuring that no one could get off. It looked hopeless. He's sitting there with his family, his wife and children, trying to calm them down. But in his mind, he knew what was going to happen. And he was relaying the story, and I said, but you're here. What happened? And he said, somewhere about halfway through that train ride, a young Serbian soldier opened the door of the train berth that they were in. And he said, Professor Mustafa, you recognize me? And the professor looked at him. He said, you were one of my students at the university. The young man said, yes, I was. I was, and you always treated me with kindness, and you taught me a lot. And he stepped inside and in a low voice said, the train's going to stop in 7 minutes. This door is going to be unlocked, and the door to the outside is going to be unlocked. If you don't get off the train then, I can't help you. And he turned around and walked away. And in 7 minutes, the train stopped. And Professor Mustafa looked outside. And he opened the door, which was unlocked. He looked outside, saw no one. He led his family off the train into a ditch with the few possessions that they had. It was almost dark by that time. They laid in the darkness in that muddy ditch, flat on their faces, until the train left. And then they still laid there for a long time after that, too afraid to move. And finally they got up and made their way back to Pristina. And they survived that war because of the kindness of a young Serbian soldier who put his ethnic and nationalistic differences aside to help a professor that he truly admired. That story was the exception, not the rule. The rest of the people on that train most likely went to their doom. So it certainly was an exception. There are stories on the Serbian side as well. And I will relay some of those when we deep dive into the country of Serbia, where I also worked. But my point is this. All that tragedy, all that angst, the genocide that erased the lives and the fortunes and the futures of so many people. Where did it start? It started with a ruler who put nationalism ahead of everything else. I want to really reinforce the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is a love for your country. And I'm a big proponent of patriotism. I believe that you should love your country and that you should be willing to sacrifice for your country. But nationalism is something different. Nationalism is believing that your country or your ethnicity is the only one that is right, is the only one that is just, and that everyone else must be either wrong or inferior. Nationalism destroys societies. It destroyed the former Yugoslavia. It destroyed the countries that made up the former Yugoslavia. And they had to be rebuilt in the best way possible, and Kosovo was certainly one of those. And there was nationalism on both sides. The Kosovo Liberation Army did some deplorable things during the war, just as the army of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia did. There's blood on everybody's hands. But the seeds of that war and all the wars that happened in the Balkans in the 1990s were sowed by nationalism. And when you pair nationalism and the belief of a people that we are somehow better than others, or we're somehow more right or more just than others, and you pair that with a leader who plays on those fears and those desires, that's a toxic cocktail of terrible, terrible things that are going to happen. And that's what happened in Kosovo. I spent way too much time there sitting with people, both Albanian Kosovars and Serbs, sobbing, telling me their stories. And I don't diminish that. I'm glad that I heard those stories because it helped me understand to the degree that I could understand what they had been through and the reasons why we need to be tolerant as a people, that we need to seek to understand each other, that we need to open our minds and open our hearts to others who are different than us, who have different religions and different ethnicities and different political beliefs. Because if we don't do that, we end up in a dark, dark place. And this is where they ended up. And it can happen in any country in the world, regardless of how large or small. And it can happen very quickly. It happens almost without detection until it's too late, until those seeds grow into something that is awful. So I've been back to Kosovo now, and as I said, it's a much different place. Over the last couple of years, I've been to Kosovo 3 or 4 times. Much different place than it used to be. It's modernized. It's now got a good hotel. I don't have to think about the Grand Hotel anymore. Now I can stay at the Swiss Diamond Hotel, which is one of the best hotels I've ever stayed in. It's got people that are really moving the country forward with the help of their international partners. But the scars are still there. You can never sop up all the blood that was spread in that was shed in that country. The hills are still crying out with the screams of those who are gone, who are erased because of a megalomaniac and his designs on regional domination. So for all of that progress, the torment is still there. But blessings to the Kosovars, because they've been able to find a way through this maze. They've been able to find a way to grasp a future that they thought had eluded them. And so Professor Mustafa Shefia, my great friend Aphrodita, her family, many others that I know in Kosovo, I think about them daily. And I channel all the good thoughts that I have toward their goal of building the kind of society where their children and their grandchildren are never going to have to go through what they had to go through. Today, we're talking about that in the context of Kosovo. In future episodes, we'll talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina. We'll talk about Croatia. We'll talk about Montenegro. We'll talk about Serbia. Tragedy all through the Balkans. And we'll unpack it more as we move forward. Hope you've enjoyed this overview of Kosovo today and some of the stories I've relayed. Don't forget, today's the day. Some Stops Along the Way is live. Grab your copy, and we will see you next time on Some Stops Along the Way. See you Monday.